a bit of a loose end one weekend, we took a trip through the picturesque British countryside to that jewel of the north, York. And like everybody who visits York, our first stop was the Jorvik Viking Museum.
But this was 1/3 of 1/2 of one queue to get in. We've been here before, so I decided, bugger that for a game of soldiers.
This place has been a walled city since about 71 AD when the Romans first settled the area. They built fortifications to protect themselves from the marauding Scots, who were busy slaughtering their natural enemies, the Romans, the English, and the Scots. There's not much left of the Roman walls except for this, the rather unimaginatively named multi-angular tower in the museum gardens. It dates from around 310 to 320 AD when Constantine the Great was out and about trying to convert the heathens to Christianity. And these are not bathtubs, this was a graveyard too. Evidently not a terribly secure one. Anyway, after the Vikings took over the place, they got serious. They demolished the Roman walls and they rebuilt them, and by the 14th century York was pretty much encircled. You can now walk around the walls to your heart's content. There's a total of about 3.4 kilometres worth to have a look at, and there are 5 large bars along the way, but don't get your hopes up. A bar is just a huge gate, nothing to get excited about. It is a great way to see York, and you'll find out all sorts of things about the city and the walls that surround it, like this. The walls weigh 100,000 tons. It's a true fact. Now, who the hell worked that one out? And why? As I've said elsewhere, the best way to see any city, or anywhere else for that matter, is from the deck of a boat. So we took a stroll under the Leland Bridge and booked ourselves a couple of seats on Boatham at Boatface to see if York is any different. And as you can see, it isn't. York straddles a quiet stretch of the River Ouse, which brings me to the big question as far as York is concerned. Who on earth decided to call this inoffensive, peaceable little waterway the River Ouse? What was that, the end of a long day at the Ministry of Naming Rivers? Just imagine that meeting. Okay, I'll bring this meeting to order. I've got it. What about we call it the River Snot? No? Okay, how about the River Slime? No, don't like that one either. The Phlegm? No. Really buying my audience here. How about the River Mucus? Okay, how about we call it the River Ooze? Excellent. Okay, that's the end of this meeting. Last one in the pub's a druid. Let's go. In fact, the truth is almost as unedifying as that. Ooze is derived from an old Celtic word meaning water. So after a long day of deliberations, doubtless at 5 PM, they decided not to call this charming little river after something you need to shift with a plumber's helper. They called it the River Water. Next you'll be telling me that York is derived from the Celtic word for city. And if you've got nothing better to do, you can stop off here in the grounds of St George's Church in Fishergate and have a shufty at the grave of Dick Turnip, the dandy highwayman. Despite the fact that almost all of Turnip's crimes were committed in and around London, he was arrested here in York, convicted of stealing 3 horses and hanged in 1739, horse stealing being a capital crime in those days, along with everything else. Now that's a bit like Bernie Madoff being arrested for shoplifting a pair of underpants in Marks and Spencer's, because far from being a dandy highwayman, Turnip was, well, a bit of a dick, pardon the expression. He murdered at least 2 people in cold blood, and his gang specialised in home invasions with a twist. The occupants of the house were tortured until they handed over the goodies. Anyway, don't bother coming along here to express your displeasure at his mortal remains, because nobody knows if he's actually down there. Shortly after he was buried, as was the custom in those days, he was dug up and his mortal remains sold to the local medical school. If you're still feeling a bit spiritual after putting Dick Turnip's immortal soul to bed, then you've come to the right place, because York is church ground zero. This is St Helens in Stonegate, and there's been a church on this spot since the 14th century, but not this incarnation. This one was opened for business in 1858, and there's an impressive collection of famous people buried here, but, well, nobody had ever heard of. Of course, if you are looking for a church to call your own, then you can't go past the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St Peter in York, and I've never heard of that one either. Few people have, because you and I and everybody else knows it as York Minster. Now this is one big church. It's 158 metres from one end to the other, and the tallest tower is 53 metres straight up. In fact, this is the fourth church to stand on this spot, and if it wasn't for some nifty engineering work in the late 60s and early 70s, you might be looking at incarnation number 5. You see, York Minster 4 was built on the foundations of a previous, rather less massive version, and that proved to be fairly inadequate. The whole thing was about to disappear into a very large cloud of dust and ecclesiastically significant rubble, but £2 million worth of bracing and reinforcement kept things standing. Mind you, all of that good work was almost for nothing. On July the 9th, 1984, the south transept was struck by lightning. The resultant fire did £2.5 million worth of damage before it was brought under control by the heroic efforts of firefighters from York and Scarborough and Harrogate, amongst others. The medieval rose window, one of the largest and most ornate rose windows in the world, barely survived, with 40,000 individual heat-stress cracks later being found in the glass. It wasn't all good news. The roof of the transept fell in, and fortunately nobody was standing underneath it to give a first-hand account, as the smouldering timbers filled the entire room to a depth of almost 2 metres. Repairs took 4 years and cost £23 million. Now, okay, the second largest Gothic cathedral in Europe. It took 272 years to build, and it's been catering to the local parish since 1472. And it nearly ends up as a pile of charred Tadcaster limestone and stained glass because of a lightning strike? What's that all about? Mind you, if York Minster had fallen over, it would be in good company, because York is alive with buildings that have seen better days, those days being hundreds or even thousands of years ago. This is St Leonard's Hospital, or what's left of it. It was founded just after William the Conqueror made his successful takeover bid in 1066, and it was one of the largest and most active hospitals in Britain until the Reformation, when Henry VIII downgraded it from hospital to smoking ruin. Mind you, as ruins go, this is the big boy on the block. This is Clifford Tower, and it's what's left of York Castle. Through its many incarnations, this place has seen some of the most atrociously bloody events in British history. In the 12th century, you weren't really welcome on board unless you had I Heart King Richard tattooed on your foreskin, and less so if you didn't have a foreskin in the first place. In 1190, about 160 Jewish men, women and children were besieged in the tower. Not this one, but an old wooden structure that stood on this spot. And they committed suicide, and the last man standing burned the tower to the ground rather than be butchered by the rabid mob waiting for them outside, which is precisely the fate that befell the few survivors. Look it up if you want to see how little history really changes. Anyway, from there to a piece of modern history. This is the Shambles, the most famous street in York. It isn't called the Shambles because it's all a bit higgledy-piggledy, but because this used to be where the butchers displayed their wares on the large wooden shelves outside their shops, and these were known as the Flesh Shambles. The gutters along the street are deeper than you'd expect, so that blood and the occasional bit of manky offal nobody wanted to buy could float away unencumbered. Fortunately, the Shambles has now cleaned up its act. The meat market is no more, and if you have a shop on the Shambles, you let the world know about it. I loved the Shambles, and I had the time of my life in York, and so will you. And I can't think of a better way to end this essay than to be played out by these dancing fools.